On the morning of September 15, 1862, white flags appeared above the Union defenses at Harpers Ferry. Confederate artillery had found the range. A turning movement threatened the rear of the Federal line, and approximately 12,500 Union soldiers were about to become prisoners. Their commander, Colonel Dixon Miles, was mortally wounded by a Confederate shell after his officers had agreed to surrender. The capitulation would be the largest surrender of United States troops in American history until the fall of Bataan nearly 80 years later. The victory belonged to a larger Confederate operation designed by Robert E. Lee, but its execution had been entrusted primarily to Thomas Jonathan "Stonewall" Jackson. It required separate columns to cross rivers and mountains, occupy commanding heights, coordinate artillery, and close a trap while another Union army hurried toward the scene. Was Harpers Ferry Jackson's greatest achievement of the Civil War? Or did overwhelming numbers, favorable terrain, and a deficient opponent make the victory appear more impressive than it really was? Answering requires more than counting prisoners. The operation must be measured against Jackson's accomplishments and failures, then examined on its own terms. The issue is whether he converted Lee's strategic purpose into a coordinated success under severe pressure, and whether his experience and decisions materially shaped the result. The setting was one Jackson knew unusually well. Harpers Ferry lies where the Shenandoah River joins the Potomac. The historic town occupies low ground beneath steep heights. Maryland Heights rises across the Potomac to the northeast. Loudoun Heights overlooks the town from across the Shenandoah to the southeast. West of the rivers, Bolivar Heights and the more distant Schoolhouse Ridge guard the land approach from the Shenandoah Valley. Transportation routes converged there. The Baltimore and Ohio Railroad crossed the Potomac, while regional roads connected the Shenandoah Valley, Northern Virginia, and Maryland. Yet the town was extremely difficult to defend if an enemy controlled the surrounding heights. Artillery on those elevations could dominate the lower ground, river crossings, and parts of the perimeter. Holding Harpers Ferry meant controlling the surrounding landscape, not merely placing troops in town. The rivers and ridges complicated an attacker's work as well. A force approaching from only one direction could be stopped by water, steep slopes, or a prepared line on the heights. Separate Confederate columns would need to use different roads, preserve communications across natural barriers, and place artillery where trees and uneven ground did not block its fire. Harpers Ferry was vulnerable only after an attacker solved those practical problems. The same geography that could trap a garrison could also isolate the forces trying to surround it. Jackson had inspected the area, considered its defense, and tested its approaches during an earlier operation. That knowledge did not remove every obstacle, but it helped him recognize the position's strengths and vulnerabilities and why a frontal assault was unnecessary. Local knowledge meant more than remembering the names of ridges. It meant understanding which elevations actually commanded the town, where river crossings restricted movement, and how quickly a defender could shift troops between sectors. It also helped Jackson distinguish an imposing position from a useful one. A ridge shown prominently on the map might offer poor fields of fire, while broken ground that appeared insignificant could conceal infantry or guns moving toward a flank. Intense observation was one part of a complicated military personality. Jackson was born on January 21, 1824, in Clarksburg, Virginia, in the region that became West Virginia. His parents died when he was young, and he spent much of his childhood among relatives with little formal preparation for the United States Military Academy. At West Point, Jackson struggled because his education had left him behind many classmates, especially in mathematics. He responded with relentless discipline, improved steadily, and graduated in 1846. Later stories claimed another year would have carried him to the head of his class. That cannot be proved, but it reflects an authentic trait. Once committed, Jackson applied himself with exceptional persistence. He carried that determination into the Mexican-American War. As an artillery officer, he distinguished himself in the campaign ending with the capture of Mexico City, earning promotions, favorable notice, and a reputation for bravery. The war also deepened his religious interests. He eventually became a devout Presbyterian whose faith shaped his habits, sense of duty, and certainty in questions of conduct and command. Peacetime service proved less satisfying. Jackson served in Florida, where he clashed with his superior, William H. French.
Battalion,
In 1851, he left the United States Army to teach at the Virginia Military Institute in Lexington. He became professor of natural and experimental philosophy, including what would now be called physics, and taught artillery tactics. Jackson understood artillery and could teach its practical employment from experience. His natural philosophy instruction was rigid and difficult to follow. He memorized carefully prepared lectures and resisted rephrasing them when cadets did not understand. Early students mocked him, but many came to respect his discipline, integrity, and professional knowledge. Artillery training encouraged attention to distance, elevation, fields of fire, and the relationship between guns and terrain. Those habits did not make Jackson a flawless artillery commander, but they mattered at Harpers Ferry, where the decisive question was not simply how many cannon the Confederates possessed. Guns had to reach positions from which their fire intersected, supported infantry movement, and exposed defenses from more than one direction. His professional background made that problem familiar, even when the physical labor belonged to subordinate officers and crews. His literal approach to instructions also became part of his reputation. Some Lexington anecdotes were polished through retelling, but the pattern is clear. Jackson valued precision, obedience, and duty. In war, those qualities produced remarkable concentration, but could also make him inflexible, secretive, and difficult for subordinates to interpret. His family life included repeated loss. His first wife, Eleanor Junkine, died at 1854, and their child was stillborn. Jackson later married Mary Anna Morrison. Their first daughter, Mary Graham, died in infancy. Their second, Julia, was born in November 1862 and survived him. These experiences and his faith reinforced his characteristic solemnity. Jackson's first documented connection with the region came before the Civil War. On December 2, 1859, he commanded the Virginia Military Institute Cadet Artillery Detachment, guarding John Brown's execution at Charlestown, near Harpers Ferry. Brown's raid on the Federal Armory had intensified the national crisis over slavery. Jackson's limited military role brought him into a landscape soon central to his career. After Virginia seceded in 1861, Jackson took cadets to Richmond to help train arriving troops, then received orders for Harpers Ferry. He arrived on April 27th or 28th and commanded the Virginia forces there until May 24th. Remaining with his brigade until the Confederate withdrawal on June 14th, he spent about 6 weeks in the area. Jackson organized volunteers, imposed military routines, prepared an exposed position, and studied how the surrounding heights governed the town. General Joseph E. Johnston later superseded him in overall command, but Jackson left with intimate knowledge of the rivers, roads, ridges, and approaches. That first tenure also taught him the limits of holding the town itself. Troops, supplies, bridges, rail lines, and artillery crowded into a basin whose security depended on ground outside the immediate settlement. No commander stationed below could ignore Maryland Heights or the approaches along Bolivar Heights. By September 1862, Jackson was attacking rather than defending, but the essential relationship remained the same. Control of the surrounding terrain determined whether the town was a strong point, a supply center, or a trap. Harpers Ferry also contributed something personal to his story. His quartermaster, John Harmon, acquired horses from a captured Union shipment. Jackson selected a larger animal for himself and a smaller chestnut for his wife. The larger horse proved difficult, while the smaller was steady and comfortable. Jackson kept the smaller horse, Little Sorrel, which carried him through many later campaigns. By the summer of 1861, Jackson was no longer an obscure professor. At the First Battle of Manassas on July 21st, his brigade helped stabilize the Confederate position on Henry Hill. Jackson placed his infantry near the crest, supported artillery, and held while other units rallied. During the crisis, Brigadier General Barnard B. associated him with the image of a stone wall. B's exact words remain uncertain. The familiar version urging men to rally behind Jackson was reconstructed from later accounts, and historians debate its wording and tone. The result is not disputed. Jackson became Stonewall, his brigade the Stonewall Brigade, and a relatively unknown officer became a Confederate symbol. First Manassas did not prove consistent command excellence. Jackson's troops performed well in a defensive crisis, but the collective victory involved many commands. He neither designed the campaign nor directed the army, and his reputation expanded faster than his record. That distinction matters because Jackson's career included failures, misunderstandings, uneven battlefield performances, and tensions with subordinates. His greatest victories are more instructive beside those less successful episodes. The Romney expedition of January 1862 offered an early warning. Jackson moved from Winchester into Western Virginia's mountains to drive Union forces from Romney and disrupt their regional use. Snow, ice, inadequate shelter, illness, and exhaustion damaged morale. The Confederates gained ground and forced a Union withdrawal, but many officers thought the hardship disproportionate to the result. Political and military interference over troop dispositions at Romney deepened the crisis, and Jackson submitted his resignation. Virginia officials persuaded him to withdraw it, but the episode exposed his sharp response to perceived interference and damaged confidence among officers who considered his demands severe and explanations inadequate. The operation showed endurance, but limited gains came with substantial internal disruption. The Battle of Kernstown on March 23, 1862, was a clearer tactical setback. Acting on faulty intelligence, Jackson believed he faced a smaller Union force near Winchester and attacked despite being outnumbered. Fighting concentrated around a stone wall on Sandy Ridge. When the Stonewall Brigade ran low on ammunition under mounting pressure, Brigadier General Richard Garnett ordered a withdrawal. Jackson considered the retreat unauthorized and brought Garnett before a court-martial, though operations prevented its completion. The controversy damaged their relationship and exposed a recurring weakness. Jackson expected determined execution, but did not always provide enough information for sound independent judgment. Kernstown was a battlefield defeat with an unexpected strategic effect. Union leaders exaggerated Jackson's threat in the Shenandoah Valley and retained or redirected troops to counter him, complicating federal concentration against Richmond. Jackson had not planned defeat to produce that result. It arose from Union interpretation and did not erase his mistakes. The campaign that followed transformed his reputation. During May and June 1862, Jackson moved rapidly through the Shenandoah Valley, struck separated Union forces, used mountain barriers to conceal movement, and repeatedly escaped entrapment. Opposing commands associated with Nathaniel Banks, John C. Fremont, Irvin McDowell, and James Shields could not concentrate in time to destroy him. Jackson's army marched extraordinary distances, earning the later name Foot Cavalry. At McDowell, Front Royal, Winchester, Cross Keys, and Port Republic, speed and geography let him confront divided opponents. Movements were not always smooth. Orders could be unclear. Troops became exhausted and confusion recurred. Yet the campaign succeeded operationally. The succession of marches worked because geography and timing reinforced one another. Mountain ranges screened lateral movement. Roads through the valley provided interior connections, and rapid changes of direction forced different Union commanders to make decisions with incomplete information. Jackson did not have to defeat all of them at once. He needed to threaten one, disengage before the others arrived, and concentrate against another. The result came from repeatedly creating temporary local advantages rather than from possessing a permanent superiority across the theater. Its strategic purpose extended beyond the valley. Major General George B. McClellan was advancing toward Richmond on the Virginia Peninsula, and Union troops near Fredericksburg might reinforce him. By threatening Washington's approaches and occupying several federal commands, Jackson helped prevent fuller concentration against the Confederate capital. Jackson did not act alone. Lee,
We must
then a
press the
senior
advantage in
military
the valley
advisor
and
to
cross the
Confederate
Potomac
President
before they
Jefferson
reorganize.
Davis,
See that it
encouraged
is done,
operations that
General.
increased pressure on the Union High Command. Jackson translated that purpose into rapid movement across familiar terrain, repeatedly forcing opponents to respond to where he seemed to be while preparing to move elsewhere. The Valley Campaign made him internationally famous, while the Confederacy reeled from reverses including New Orleans and Shiloh. Newspapers presented him as proof that determination and maneuver could offset material disadvantage. That story simplified the battle's scale and his opponent's weaknesses, but it carried political and psychological force. If greatness is measured by strategic distraction with limited forces, the Valley Campaign is a leading candidate for Jackson's finest work. It integrated terrain, movement, timing, and political effect, turning a prominent brigadier general into one of the Confederacy's most famous soldiers. Its breadth complicates comparison with Harpers Ferry. The campaign was a sequence of marches and battles whose impact depended partly on Union fears and decisions. Harpers Ferry would produce a more measurable result: a surrounded garrison, formal capitulation, and thousands of prisoners. Jackson's next assignment showed that Valley success did not guarantee reliable performance elsewhere.
The
In
roads
late
east are
June
difficult, General.
1862,
Regardless, we must
he
press
joined
the advance
Lee
through the
east of
swamp.
Richmond for the
Send word to
7
General
days'
Jackson
battles.
to hurry.
Lee expected his command to help turn McClellan's position, but it repeatedly arrived late, halted unexpectedly, or failed to press at critical moments. At White Oak Swamp, Jackson did not force the crossing Lee's plan required, and Confederate attacks elsewhere proceeded without the intended pressure. Exhaustion, illness, poor maps, difficult roads, damaged bridges, incomplete information, command confusion, and unfamiliar ground all contributed. Those explanations matter, but do not make his performance successful. The 7 days exposed the difference between moving an independent column toward a broad strategic purpose and coordinating several columns at a precise place and time. If one force halted, attacked late, or misunderstood its route, pressure shifted onto troops elsewhere. Harper's Ferry presented a similar danger on a smaller geographic scale. McLaws, Walker, and Jackson approached from different directions, and none could produce the intended result alone. Success would therefore answer a criticism created by Jackson's failures outside Richmond. The contrast was striking. In the Valley, Jackson operated on familiar ground with considerable independence.
Push
Near
the corps
Richmond,
forward
he
through the
entered
swamp.
an army-wide
Secure the
plan
crossroads
demanding
immediately.
close
Yes, sir.
coordination.
Move
His
out.
secrecy and uneven communication became liabilities. Harpers Ferry would test whether he could coordinate a difficult multi-column operation whose timing mattered to the entire army. Before then, Jackson delivered another mixed performance at Cedar Mountain on August 9, 1862. He moved against Nathaniel Banks while Lee sought to prevent Major General John Pope's Army of Virginia from concentrating. Banks attacked before Jackson had organized fully. Confederate units faltered, and part of the line nearly collapsed. Jackson entered the crisis personally and exposed himself while rallying troops. He famously tried to draw his sword, and his presence helped restore confidence. Reinforcements arrived, the line recovered, and Banks was driven off. The result was a Confederate victory, but serious command and deployment problems preceded it. Cedar Mountain demonstrated courage and an ability to influence soldiers under pressure. Heroic recovery, however, was not mastery from beginning to end and did not equal the complete operational performance later seen at Harpers Ferry. The Second Battle of Manassas presents a stronger rival. In August 1862, Lee sought to defeat Pope before McClellan reinforced him. Jackson moved widely around Pope, struck the Union supply base at Manassas Junction, destroyed material he could not remove, and occupied a defensive position along an unfinished railroad cut north of the old battlefield. The maneuver fixed Pope's attention. Believing he could destroy an isolated Confederate force, Pope repeatedly attacked on August 29th and 30th. Jackson's infantry endured intense pressure. Ammunition ran short, and some soldiers reportedly threw stones during close fighting. The line bent but held. While Pope concentrated against Jackson, Lieutenant Generals Longstreet's wing formed on Jackson's right.
Hold the
On
line
August
at the
30th,
cut!
after
Do not
another
let them
major Union
pass!
assault,
Reinforce the
Longstreet
center
launched a massive
immediately!
counterattack across the Union left and forced Pope's retreat. Longstreet delivered the dramatic offensive decision, but Jackson made it possible. His movement disrupted Union logistics, compelled Pope to turn, and drew assaults onto chosen ground. Lee, Jackson, Longstreet, and cavalry commander J.E. Stuart operated as parts of a larger design. 2nd Manassas demonstrated Jackson's ability to make an apparently isolated position serve a broader concentration. Pope saw an opportunity to destroy Jackson before the Confederate Army united, while Lee used that attention to bring Longstreet into position.
We must
The
take that
arrangement
position.
was dangerous
Send the
because
Alabama
Jackson's
Brigade into the
command
cut.
had
The
to
general
survive
orders the
repeated
Alabamians
attacks.
forward.
It succeeded, but its final offensive power came from another wing. At Harpers Ferry, Jackson would again hold an enemy's attention while forces approached vulnerable ground, though this time the pressure would end in surrender rather than a battlefield counterattack. Jackson deserves high marks at strategic, operational, and tactical levels. He marched around the enemy, seized a logistical center, chose favorable terrain, and held until Lee concentrated. Yet final victory depended on Longstreet's arrival and attack. Jackson was
Move up, men!
indispensable
Keep the
but
line
remained
steady!
one
We're
major
taking the
element
cut!
of Lee's success. A great achievement must connect strategy, movement, and battlefield action, not merely personal drama or fame. Harpers Ferry faced that standard under a different arrangement. Lee defined the objective and divided the columns. Jackson had to make their convergence work. The Battle of Antietam on September 17, 1862, offers another measure. After Harpers Ferry fell, Jackson moved most of his command to Sharpsburg and held the Confederate left. At dawn, Union attacks struck through the North Woods, cornfield, and ground near the Dunker Church. In one of the war's most violent sustained contests, Confederate formations were shattered, reinforced, driven back, and recommitted.
We're losing the
line
pike!
lost ground,
Get word to the
and
division! Bring up the
and
Georgia Brigade
commanders
immediately! Hold your
handled
ground,
many
men!
immediate crises, but the left survived attack high portions of 1st, 12th, and 2nd Corps. Jackson performed effectively under relentless pressure, but Antietam was no clean tactical victory.
They are
Lee
pressing the
remained
center.
through the next day,
Ride to General
then
Hill and
withdrew
tell him he
across
must
the
move his
Potomac.
division to the...
The campaign failed to secure his intended gains, and the battle allowed President Abraham Lincoln to announce the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. Jackson's role cannot be separated from campaign exhaustion and losses, and the battle was not his design. Harpers Ferry stands out because it brought him to Antietam with significant forces and gave Lee additional men to contest the field. Fredericksburg in December 1862 provides a less flattering comparison. Lee placed Jackson's corps on the Confederate right, south of town, while Longstreet held the heights north and west. Jackson's sector concentrated infantry and artillery, but included woods, low ridges, and a gap in the Confederate arrangement. On December 13th, Major General George G. Meade's Union Division exploited that area and broke into the line, creating the most dangerous Federal success on the battlefield. Confederate reserves, including troops from Jubal Early's division, counterattacked before Meade could be reinforced effectively. Jackson's position held, but the breach showed that his defenses were not flawless, and subordinates carried much of the immediate burden of repair. Later claims that Jackson entered town and helped Lee plan the battle from a street corner lack wartime support. He remained on the Confederate right and did not need to enter Fredericksburg.
Send
Jackson
word down
considered
the line.
offensive action
push through
after
the gap in
daylight,
the Stonewall
including a
when
night
darkness
attack,
falls.
which troops would use white cloth for identification, but abandoned it because darkness, disorganization, and Union strength made the risks excessive. Fredericksburg was a major Confederate victory, yet Jackson's role was uneven. The celebrated defense occurred at Longstreet's Mary's Heights, while the gravest Federal penetration came against Jackson. The Battle of Chancellorsville in May 1863 is often called Jackson's masterpiece. Facing Major General Joseph Hooker's much larger Army of the Potomac, Lee divided his outnumbered army. On May 2nd, Jackson led approximately 28,000 men through the wilderness to reach the exposed right flank of the Union 11th Corps. The maneuver relied on concealment, local roads, reconnaissance, and extraordinary risk. Union observers saw portions but mistook them for a retreat. Late that afternoon, Jackson's formations emerged west of the Union flank, giving the 11th Corps little time to change front. His men drove east for miles, capturing prisoners, overturning positions, and creating severe confusion. It was one of the war's most successful large-scale flanking movements and demonstrated Lee and Jackson's willingness to divide forces and strike vulnerability rather than strength. Danger remained. Confederate formations became mixed and exhausted in the dense woods. Darkness impaired command and control. Union resistance consolidated around Chancellorsville, and Lee and Jackson remained separated. The tactical opportunity was real, but so was the risk of disorder or counterattack. That night, while reconnoitering ahead of his lines, Jackson returned toward Confederates who mistook his party for Union cavalry. Soldiers of the 18th North Carolina Infantry opened fire. Wounded several times, Jackson lost his left arm to amputation and died of pneumonia on May 10th. The brilliant march is not diminished because Jackson was mortally wounded, but it was not a completed independent operation. Lee conceived the division with him, while other officers reorganized the command, renewed battle, and reconnected the separated wings. Chancellorsville may be Jackson's most famous maneuver, but Harpers Ferry offer a completed operation ending in surrender without crippling losses to his command. Chancellorsville cost Lee an irreplaceable lieutenant and thousands of men. Harpers Ferry strengthened him immediately, though the wider campaign remained precarious. Gettysburg belongs in the comparison because Jackson's absence became part of its memory. He had been dead more than 7 weeks when Lee entered Pennsylvania in July 1863. After the Confederates failed to capture Cemetery Hill on the first day, commentators asked whether Jackson would have
whether the
acted more
Confederate
decisively
field commander
than
leading the
Lieutenant
western
General
approach
Richard Ewell.
would have acted more.
The counterfactual cannot be settled. Ewell faced unfamiliar ground, exhausted formations, incomplete reconnaissance, ambiguous instructions, and Union reinforcements. He conducted personal reconnaissance and worried about flank threats, behaviors consistent with Jackson's own habits. Treating Jackson as an automatic guarantee of victory substitutes legend for analysis. That legend shows how memory enlarged him into an imagined solution to later Confederate failures. Harpers Ferry requires no speculation. Its achievement can be tested against a plan, deadline, geographic problem, and documented result. Jackson's earlier experience supplied the foundation. His 6 weeks there in 1861 taught him that the low town was insecure if the heights were lost. In late May 1862, during the Valley Campaign, he returned while pursuing Union troops northward after driving banks across the Potomac. Brigadier General Rufus Saxton commanded the Union garrison. Unlike a commander focused only on the town, Saxton occupied surrounding terrain and strengthened his position. Jackson tested the approaches but lacked unlimited time because columns under Fremont and Shields threatened his route south. Jackson withdrew and drove his army toward Strasburg through punishing weather and long marches. The Union commands failed to close the routes in time, allowing him to escape, turn against his pursuers, and complete the Valley Campaign at Cross Keys and Port Republic. The encounter showed that Harpers Ferry was not automatically defenseless. A capable commander occupying the relevant ground could make its approaches dangerous. It also showed that time was essential because any operation against the garrison depended on larger armies elsewhere. Those lessons returned in September 1862.
Send
After
word to
Second
General
Manassas,
Longstreet.
Lee took
He is
the
to
Army
secure
of
that
Northern
position by
Virginia
nightfall.
across the
Yes, sir.
Potomac
Consider it
into
done.
Maryland. He sought to move fighting from damaged Virginia, obtain supplies, threaten Union communications, and perhaps encourage political effects in the North and abroad. He also hoped to draw the Union Army into battle on favorable terms. Harpers Ferry complicated the movement. Lee expected the garrison to withdraw, but it remained, threatening communications through the lower Shenandoah Valley and potentially interfering with supplies and reinforcements. He decided to capture it before continuing deeper into Maryland.
This is Special Orders
number
191.
dividing
We must take the
arm
ferry
into
before the
columns.
Federals can react.
Longstreet and other elements moved toward Boonesboro and Hagerstown. Major General Lafayette McLaws approached Maryland Heights. Brigadier General John G. Walker moved against Loudoun Heights, and Jackson's approximately 14,000 men recrossed the Potomac to approach Harpers Ferry from the west. Lee, not Jackson, designed the division and assigned the routes. Jackson was to direct the central effort and coordinate McLaws and Walker at the objective. The Confederates held a numerical advantage, but mountains and rivers separated their forces, and every delay endangered Lee's divided army. The schedule depended on more than marching speed. Each column needed passable roads, artillery ammunition, food, and access to crossings suitable for men, horses, wagons, and cannon. McLaws had to seize difficult high ground north of the town. Walker had to reach a useful position south of the Shenandoah. Jackson had to approach from the west while maintaining enough pressure to keep Miles oriented toward Bolivar Heights. If any part arrived late or occupied ground from which its guns could not contribute, the garrison might remain intact while the Army of the Potomac closed on Lee. Jackson left Frederick on September 10th. His troops crossed South Mountain, moved through western Maryland, crossed the Potomac near Williamsport, and advanced through Martinsburg. Union troops withdrew from there toward Harpers Ferry. Jackson approached from the west and occupied Schoolhouse Ridge, opposite the main federal line on Bolivar Heights. Colonel Dixon S. Miles commanded Union troops at Harpers Ferry and Martinsburg. Once the Martinsburg force joined him, his command numbered about 14,200. An experienced regular officer whose reputation had suffered after first Bull Run. Miles faced a difficult assignment and instructions emphasizing that he hold the place. Miles established his principal line on Bolivar Heights, covering the western approach towards Schoolhouse Ridge. It was formidable against direct attack. Union artillery held an elevation advantage, and open ground exposed forces advancing from the west. The line made sense if the principal threat came directly from Jackson. Infantry and guns on Bolivar Heights could contest the most obvious road from the valley and force an attacker across exposed ground. The problem was that the position formed only one portion of a much larger perimeter. Miles needed enough troops to hold his western front while preventing Confederate forces from placing artillery above or beside it. His garrison was large, but defending several separated heights required clear priorities, reliable subordinate leadership, and timely movement between sectors. The fatal weakness lay elsewhere. Miles left Loudoun Heights unoccupied and assigned insufficient strength to hold Maryland Heights securely. By focusing on Bolivar Heights, he treated Jackson's visible column as the main danger. The surrounding terrain allowed the other Confederate columns to turn that defensive front into one wall of a trap. Maryland Heights was the most important commanding ground. Its slopes were steep and difficult, but artillery there could threaten the town and Federal defenses. Miles assigned Colonel Thomas Ford's troops to hold it. They prepared works, but command problems, limited experience, and incomplete appreciation of the stakes weakened the position. Defending Maryland Heights required more than placing a line near the summit. The wooded slopes restricted visibility, narrow approaches complicated reinforcement, and troops forced back from one position needed organized support behind them. Because the height dominated the Potomac crossings and the town below, losing it had consequences beyond the local fight. Confederate guns there could help close escape routes and combine with batteries on other elevations. A temporary withdrawal on the mountain could therefore become a strategic collapse for the entire garrison. On September 13th, McLaws' Confederates attacked through rugged, wooded terrain. Union defenders resisted, but Confederate pressure, confused leadership, and fear of being turned contributed to their collapse. Ford ordered survivors to withdraw across the pontoon bridge into Harpers Ferry. Abandoning Maryland Heights transformed the operation. Union soldiers tried to disable heavy guns they could not remove, but the Confederates gained the commanding ground. The town was exposed from the north and east. Miles still held Bolivar Heights, yet the geographic logic of his position was turning against him.
Fire!
Walker reached
Adjust
Loudoun
elevation!
Heights from
Bring
the
that
south,
other Napoleon
but
up the
found
slope
his first
immediately!
position lacked an effective artillery
Yes, General!
view.
Keep...
Occupying a point labeled on a map was insufficient. Guns had to cross steep terrain and reach places where their crews could fire into the Federal position. Jackson arrived on Schoolhouse Ridge. The three wings now surrounded Harpers Ferry, but physical convergence did not ensure coordination. Rivers separated them. Messages required time. Guns had to be dragged into place. Roads kept open, and each commander saw only part of the field. This was the moment when the operation could have stalled despite apparent encirclement. Infantry visible on three sides did not by itself compel surrender. Miles still organized troops and a strong line facing west. Confederate commanders needed to understand where neighboring columns had arrived and when their batteries would be ready. Premature pressure from one direction might reveal intentions without producing a decision, while waiting too long could allow Federal relief forces to intervene. At the same time, the strategic clock accelerated. On September 13th, Union soldiers found a lost copy of Special Orders Number 191 wrapped around cigars. The document reached Major General George B. McClellan, commander of the Army of the Potomac, revealing Lee's divided army and the movements around Harpers Ferry. The order was several days old, and McClellan still had to cross mountain passes. Nevertheless, it offered a major opportunity. A rapid advance might break through South Mountain, relieve Harpers Ferry, and attack Lee's separated forces before they reunited. Lee now faced the danger inherent in his design. McLaws stood between Maryland Heights and the approaching Union 6th Corps. Walker was south of the Potomac, Jackson west of Harpers Ferry, and Lee and Longstreet farther north. A delayed surrender could expose each column to defeat in detail. The discovery did not instantly place the Union Army at Harpers Ferry, but it shortened the margin for Confederate error. Every hour spent moving artillery or exchanging messages now had strategic importance. Jackson could not assume that possession of the heights would eventually force surrender at his convenience. He needed a result before Franklin broke through McLaws' rear, before Lee had to recall the detached columns, or before Miles used the sound of nearby fighting as reason to prolong resistance. On September 14th, fighting erupted at South Mountain's Gaps. At Crampton's Gap, Union troops under Major General William B. Franklin broke through Confederate defenders and entered Pleasant Valley. McLaws had to protect his rear while pressuring Harpers Ferry. Franklin was close, but terrain, remaining resistance, uncertain information, and cautious decisions slowed the relief effort. Union officers inside Harpers Ferry heard the fighting and knew help might be approaching. That possibility encouraged Miles to hold but warned Jackson against delay. A direct attack across open ground toward Bolivar Heights could cause heavy casualties without a quick decision. Jackson used artillery and demanded surrender, but Miles refused. The initial bombardment did not force capitulation. Bolivar Heights remained a strong frontal position, and the garrison retained substantial artillery. Continued attacks against the same face risked allowing the approaching Union Army to overtake events. The central test became how Jackson could make Miles's strongest line irrelevant before relief arrived. The answer lay on the exposed Union left. Major General Ambrose Powell Hill, commanding one of Jackson's divisions, investigated between the Confederate front and the Shenandoah. Its difficulty concealed a route around the southern end of Miles's line. Hill requested permission to move against that flank, and Jackson approved. While defenders remained oriented towards Schoolhouse Ridge, Hill shifted infantry through lower, irregular ground near the Shenandoah. Rather than charge Bolivar Heights, he changed the battlefield's geometry. Hill's reconnaissance was important because maps and distant observation could not reveal every fold of the ground. The route had to conceal enough movement to preserve surprise, while allowing infantry and artillery to reach useful positions. Once approved, the shift also required Jackson to keep pressure on the Western Front, so Miles could not freely redeploy against it. Hill's initiative supplied the route, but Jackson's broader arrangement gave the movement its effect. A flank attack without frontal pressure might be contained. Frontal pressure combined with an emerging threat to the rear made the entire line unstable. Confederate artillery officers sought positions allowing fire along the Union line instead of directly against its prepared front. Flanking artillery could sweep the defenses with enfilading fire, exploiting the southern vulnerability Miles had failed to secure. Jackson coordinated final pressure with McLaws and Walker. Batteries on Maryland and Loudoun Heights overlooked the basin. Guns on Jackson's front faced Bolivar Heights, and Hill's movement brought weapons against the Union left and rear. Separate columns became one artillery system. That concentration multiplied the value of each battery. Guns firing only from Schoolhouse Ridge faced Union artillery and earthworks arranged to meet them. Guns firing from the heights and southern flank forced Federal crews to respond to several angles at once. A position offering cover against one direction might be exposed from another. The purpose was not simply to produce a louder bombardment. It was to deny the defenders a secure orientation, disrupt movement behind their line, and support Hill's infantry before it had to make a costly assault. The maneuver required labor as well as judgment. Crews moved guns over rough ground and prepared positions during the night of September 14th and 15th. Infantry advanced to support the batteries and threaten escape routes. The Confederates did not need to storm every position if they could demonstrate that resistance was useless. Moving cannon at night involved practical risks. Teams and crews had to negotiate narrow tracks without announcing every position to the enemy, then place ammunition and establish fields of fire before dawn. Infantry needed to remain close enough to protect the batteries without blocking them. These tasks explain why possession of commanding terrain did not immediately end the siege. The heights became decisive only after men converted them into functioning gun positions connected to a coordinated plan. Jackson also ordered diversionary pressure on the Union right to hold Federal attention while Hill turned the opposite flank. The sequence mattered. A threat on one sector restricted Miles's response, before the flanking movement exposed defenses that had appeared secure from the west. Before dawn on September 15th, the arrangement was substantially complete. More than 50 guns surrounded the garrison. When they opened fire, shells arrived from multiple directions. Federal artillery responded, but no single line of earthworks could meet the threat. The high ground and southern approaches Miles neglected were in Confederate hands. Hill's troops prepared to advance against the vulnerable left, while Confederate guns could strike the Federal line from the side and rear. Franklin had not arrived. The defenders were not merely under bombardment. A coordinated force had removed the geographic basis for resistance. Miles convened a council of war, and his officers agreed the position could not be held. White flags appeared. Only after the decision, as firing ended, did a Confederate shell burst near Miles and mangle his left leg. Carried from the field, he died the next day, September 16th. With Miles incapacitated, Brigadier General Julius White completed the formal surrender. Approximately 12,500 Union troops became prisoners. This was fewer than Miles's total command, partly because a large cavalry force had escaped during the night. Crossing the Potomac, and riding north before the final bombardment. The Confederates now faced the logistical consequences of success. Thousands of prisoners had to be assembled, disarmed, guarded, and processed, while captured weapons and supplies were secured. Those duties consumed
on the left
time
flank
and troops
immediately.
at the same moment.
Get word to
Lee
Hood to
needed
hold the line near the
reinforcements
Dunkard
near
Church.
Sharpsburg. A victory measured by prisoners could become a burden if its administration delayed the army. Leaving Hill to complete that work while other formations departed was therefore part of converting surrender into immediate operational value. The Confederates captured artillery, small arms, ammunition, wagons, and supplies. More consequentially, an entire federal garrison ceased to operate. Confederate losses were comparatively limited, especially beside the surrender scale. That imbalance can make victory seem inevitable, but it was not. The Union held substantial troops and artillery. Saxton's earlier defense showed the approaches could be contested if the heights were used properly. A coherent defense of Maryland Heights could have delayed McLaws. Occupation of Loudoun Heights could have complicated Walker's approach, and a stronger southern flank on Bolivar Heights could have obstructed Hill. The Confederates nevertheless possessed clear advantages. Lee committed a large force against an isolated garrison. Miles misused the terrain. Many Union regiments were inexperienced, and the command structure inspired little confidence. Once Maryland Heights was abandoned, Confederate artillery made the position increasingly untenable. A fair judgment must recognize both realities. Jackson did not conquer an impregnable fortress with a smaller force, but neither did he merely accept a surrender produced by geography. Terrain became decisive because Confederate columns occupied the proper heights. Artillery reached effective positions, Hill turned the exposed flank, and Jackson coordinated pressure before relief arrived. Lee deserves credit for the operational conception. Special Orders Number 191 assigned the converging routes and integrated Harpers Ferry into the Maryland campaign. McLaws, Walker, Hill, and Confederate artillery officers and crews executed essential parts. Calling it Jackson's achievement does not mean he created or accomplished it alone. Jackson's role remained central. He commanded the largest column, controlled the western approach, supervised final coordination, avoided a costly frontal assault, approved Hill's movement, and directed combined pressure that made surrender unavoidable. He converted dispersed convergence into a completed battlefield result. His contribution lay partly in deciding what not to do. An immediate assault on Bolivar Heights could have spent infantry against the best prepared portion of Miles' defense while leaving the heights underused. Jackson instead accepted the time required to move guns and infantry into more favorable positions, even as relief threatened. That balance between patience and urgency was difficult. Waiting made the tactical arrangement stronger, but the strategic situation more dangerous. Attacking too soon might have preserved time while sacrificing the force needed by Lee. That completion distinguishes Harper's Ferry from other episodes. At first Manassas, Jackson held a critical line but did not direct the army. In the valley, he achieved strategic distraction through a sequence of actions rather than one capitulation. Coordination failed during the 7 days. At Cedar Mountain, he recovered from near disaster. At Second Manassas, he excelled within Lee's larger victory. At Chancellorsville, his flank attack was extraordinary, but he did not live to see the operation completed. Harper's Ferry displayed abilities his previous record had placed in doubt. Movement across stretches of Maryland and Virginia, communication with separated commanders, patience before a strong frontal defense, adaptation when bombardment did not immediately succeed, and cooperation between infantry and artillery. It directly served Lee's purpose. The garrison no longer threatened Confederate communications through the lower valley. Lee could summon scattered forces toward Sharpsburg rather than move north with an enemy position behind him. The victory did not remove the Army of the Potomac, but it released Confederate columns to rejoin Lee. Jackson left Hill's division to manage the surrender, prisoners, and captured property, then moved his other available troops toward Sharpsburg. The schedule remained dangerous because Lee's army was divided, and McClellan was advancing after South Mountain. Hill completed his duties and began a rapid march on September 17th. Covering roughly 17 miles, his division reached Antietam that afternoon as Major General Ambrose Burnside's Union 9th Corps advanced against the Confederate right after crossing Antietam Creek. Hill attacked part of Burnside's force and helped halt the advance. His arrival did not erase Lee's losses or determine Antietam alone, but it supplied desperately needed strength at a critical place. Troops who had turned Miles's flank now helped prevent Lee's right from collapsing. The sequence illustrates why speed after victory mattered as much as speed before it. Jackson's other divisions had already moved toward Lee, while Hill remained behind because surrender created tasks that could not simply be ignored. Only after organizing the captured garrison and material could Hill march. His arrival late on September 17th showed how narrow the schedule had become. Had Harpers Ferry resisted longer, the same troops might still have been guarding a siege or confronting a relief effort instead of entering the fight at Antietam. This connection demonstrates the surrender's operational value. Harpers Ferry was not an isolated trophy. Its conclusion released formations for the campaign's principal battle. Another day of resistance, or relief by Franklin, could have altered the distribution of forces at Antietam substantially. Victory also carried a cost beyond Confederate casualties. Reducing Harpers Ferry prolonged Lee's dangerous dispersion. His plan assumed a quick capture, while the discovery of Special Orders No. 191 gave McClellan a chance to exploit the division. South Mountain forced Lee to abandon continued movement deeper into Maryland and concentrate for survival near Sharpsburg. Harpers Ferry rescued one element of a campaign in crisis. It did not make the Maryland Caine a Confederate strategic success. Lee failed to secure the political and military effects he sought. After Antietam, he withdrew to Virginia, and Lincoln used the opening to issue the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, changing the war's character and international meaning. A great operational victory can exist within an unsuccessful campaign. Jackson fulfilled his objective in a way that strengthened Lee immediately. But the surrender neither reversed Antietam's strategic outcome nor changed the war's ultimate direction. The capitulation's scale remains remarkable. Approximately 12,500 Union troops surrendered on September 15th. It remained the largest surrender of United States troops until April 9, 1942, when forces on the Bataan Peninsula in the Philippines capitulated to Japan. Bataan involved tens of thousands of American and Filipino troops and was far larger in a fundamentally different context. Within the Civil War, Harpers Ferry belongs beside the era's greatest surrenders. At Fort Donelson in February 1862, Union forces under Brigadier General Ulysses S. Grant compelled roughly 12,000 Confederates to surrender, opening important river routes and making Grant a national figure. At Vicksburg on July 4, 1863, approximately 29,000 Confederate troops surrendered to Grant after a long campaign and siege. Vicksburg gave the Union control of the Mississippi River and divided the Confederacy geographically, consequences far greater than those of Harpers Ferry. At Appomattox Courthouse in April 1865, Lee surrendered the Army of Northern Virginia to Grant. Parole records eventually included approximately 28,000 Confederate soldiers, though far fewer remained armed and effective in the immediate line. That surrender helped bring organized Confederate resistance toward its end. These comparisons do not place Jackson on the strategic level of Grant's whole war record. Fort Donelson, Vicksburg, and Appomattox belonged to campaigns progressively dismantling Confederate military power. Harpers Ferry removed one Union garrison without a comparable long-term transformation. They do reveal the unusual scale of Jackson's immediate result. Few Civil War operations took so many prisoners so quickly with such limited losses to the victor. Jackson achieved it not through repeated frontal assaults, but by coordinated maneuver and artillery that made the enemy's position indefensible. The comparison also clarifies the type of achievement involved. Vicksburg required a prolonged campaign, difficult movement, siege operations, and the isolation of an entire Confederate army. Appomattox represented the collapse of Lee's capacity to continue organized resistance. Harpers Ferry was shorter and more limited, but its compactness makes command decisions easier to trace. The objective, routes, deadline, tactical adjustments, and surrender formed a single connected operation, rather than the culmination of months or years of attrition. Miles's identity cannot settle the argument. His decisions contributed substantially. He concentrated on Bolivar Heights, left Loudoun Heights unsecured, and failed to ensure Maryland Heights was held with the required determination. His command suffered confusion, inexperience, and poor morale. Yet one commander's weakness becomes decisive only when an opponent exploits it. Jackson and his subordinates did not attack Miles where he was strongest merely because it was direct. They occupied neglected heights, turned the exposed flank, and placed artillery where it could fire through the geometry of the defenses. Terrain alone was insufficient. Mountains and rivers obstructed Confederates as well as Federals. Walker had to locate usable artillery to positions on Loudoun Heights. McLaws fought for Maryland Heights while guarding against Franklin. Jackson crossed the Potomac, moved through Martinsburg, and approached from the west. Hill crossed broken ground to reach the Union flank. The accomplishment was turning those difficulties into converging pressure. Geography offered possibilities rather than handing Jackson victory, and his forces used them more effectively than Miles did. Jackson's familiarity sharpened the process. His 1861 inspections taught him how the town related to the elevations. His May 1862 return showed that an alert defense could delay him and that outside armies imposed a strict deadline. In September, he understood both the ground and the problem more clearly. Experience was not sufficient by itself. McLaws and Walker operated outside Jackson's direct view. Hill deserves particular credit for finding the route around the Union left and positioning his division. Artillery officers converted high ground into practical firepower, and Lee's orders supplied the framework. The victory was collective, but Jackson's command made the parts cohere. Reputation concentrates attention on one dramatic figure. Achievement can be examined as a chain of decisions, movements, and consequences. At Harpers Ferry, that chain is unusually clear. Lee needed the garrison removed because it threatened his rear and assigned converging routes. Miles built his main line on Bolivar Heights, but left the larger position incomplete. McLaws captured Maryland Heights, Walker occupied Loudoun Heights, and Jackson confronted the western line from Schoolhouse Ridge. When bombardment and a surrender demand failed, Jackson did not waste infantry in a frontal attack. Hill moved against the exposed left, artillery shifted into enfilading positions, and diversionary pressure fixed Union attention. The final bombardment came from several directions. Without relief or a secure escape route, Miles's officers surrendered. Each step altered the next. That causal clarity measures command more effectively than a moment of personal bravery. Jackson did not need to wave a sword before collapsing troops, as at Cedar Mountain, or rely on speculation about what he might have done, as at Gettysburg. The documented sequence is enough. There is still a case for placing the Valley Campaign first. Jackson used a relatively small army to occupy multiple Union commands and influence Richmond's defense. Over many weeks, the campaign demonstrated sustained operational agility with political and psychological effects extending beyond its casualties and territory. There is also a case for Chancellorsville. The May 2nd Flank March was among the war's most audacious maneuvers, striking a larger army at its vulnerable point and producing a dramatic reversal. If greatness means battlefield boldness under extreme risk, it may rank above Harpers Ferry. 2nd Manassas is perhaps the strongest alternative as a complete battlefield performance. Jackson disrupted Pope's rear, selected his ground, endured repeated assaults, and enabled Longstreet's decisive attack. His role was central to one of Lee's most complete victories. Harpers Ferry surpasses them in a narrower but meaningful category. It was Jackson's most successful self-contained operation. Given a defined objective within Lee's campaign, he managed separated forces, adapted to a strong defense, achieved surrender under deadline, and preserved most combat power for the next battle. Calling it his greatest achievement depends on the definition. The Valley Campaign contributed more to his legend. Chancellorsville was his most famous maneuver. Second Manassas competes as his most important performance within a major victory. But if achievement means the clearest union of prior knowledge, operational movement, tactical adaptation, economy of force, and measurable result, Harpers Ferry presents the strongest case. Jackson did not act alone, and the victory could not save Lee's Maryland campaign. Still, a complicated Confederate plan reached its immediate objective almost exactly when the Army needed it. The operation also reveals a more useful Jackson than legend's figure of immovable resolve, relentless marching, stern faith, and sudden flank attacks. At Harpers Ferry, the decisive quality was restraint. Facing the strong Federal line on Bolivar Heights, Jackson declined to attack its strongest point. He allowed the geography around the defender to be reorganized, approved movement against the vulnerable flank, accumulated artillery, and coordinated pressure until resistance could no longer be justified. This was not Kernstown, where faulty intelligence led him against a stronger force, or the 7 days where coordination failed. It was not Cedar Mountain, where he restored a crisis after his line faltered. At Harpers Ferry, he did not merely recover from events. He directed separate events toward one conclusion. That conclusion came with the white flags of September 15th. The surrender released troops for Sharpsburg, removed a threat to Confederate communications, and showed what Jackson could accomplish when local knowledge, design, and subordinate initiative worked together. It did not prove Jackson infallible, erase Miles's errors or Confederate numerical superiority, or make the town invulnerable once its heights were lost. Nor did it rescue Lee's invasion from strategic defeat. A sound judgment requires none of those claims. Harpers Ferry matters because its result was both enormous and limited. Enormous in prisoners, captured material, and immediate relief to Lee. Limited because it belonged to a campaign ending at Antietam and in Confederate withdrawal. Those boundaries make the achievement more credible, not less. The question is not whether Jackson single-handedly captured an impregnable fortress. He did neither. Lee designed the convergence, Confederate officers and soldiers executed it, and Miles failed to correct serious Federal weaknesses. The question is whether Jackson recognized those conditions and converted them into a decisive result before the opportunity vanished. The evidence indicates that he did. His knowledge clarified the terrain, his command held the convergence together, his willingness to turn the flank supplied the tactical solution, and his timing allowed much of the force to return for Antietam. Against his uneven career, that combination is exceptional. Jackson could be brilliant, rigid, or dangerously ineffective. At Harpers Ferry, the strongest parts of his command ability appeared together while his most damaging habits remained largely contained. That is why Harpers Ferry can reasonably be called his greatest achievement of the war. It was not his boldest legend, most dramatic battlefield scene, or a victory that changed the war by itself. It was his most complete answer to a difficult assignment, a coordinated operation finished under pressure, with a result large enough to count and consequences important enough to matter. The Stonewall of popular memory suggests a commander defined by standing firm. Harpers Ferry reveals something more sophisticated. Jackson succeeded because he understood that the decisive point was not always directly ahead. Sometimes the surest way to break a strong position was to leave its front untouched, seize the heights around it, and make it collapse under the weight of its own geography.